Welcome back. Tonight, we delve into a fear that is as old as shelter itself, a primal dread that whispers to us in the quietest hours of the night. It's that unsettling feeling when the familiar comfort of your own home begins to feel fragile, almost transparent. The shadows outside your window seem to deepen, to shift, to take on forms that your mind struggles to dismiss. You tell yourself it's just the wind, the house settling, or perhaps an animal scurrying by. But deep down, a more chilling possibility takes root. A cold tendril of unease that creeps into your thoughts, suggesting something far more unsettling is lurking just beyond the perceived safety of your walls. We're exploring one of the most fundamentally terrifying themes in the landscape of horror, a scenario that plays on our deepest vulnerabilities. It's that specific heart-stopping moment of realization, someone's outside. That sudden, undeniable certainty that an unknown individual, an unseen entity, is present where they absolutely should not be. The sanctity of your personal space, your refuge from the world, feels instantly violated, compromised by a presence whose intentions are a terrifying mystery. It's the creak on the porch that's out of rhythm with the wind, the fleeting shadow glimpsed from the corner of your eye, the inexplicable sound that makes the hair on your arms stand on end. Tonight, we are not merely recounting fictional tales crafted for entertainment. We are bringing you three true stories, accounts from individuals who have experienced this profound and visceral fear firsthand. These are narratives of real encounters, real terror, where the line between the secure and the sinister was irrevocably crossed. The fear you will hear in these accounts is genuine, born from moments where the ordinary fabric of life was torn apart by the intrusion of the unknown and the potentially malevolent. Prepare yourselves, for these experiences are a stark reminder of how quickly safety can evaporate. So, as we embark on this journey into the heart of these chilling experiences, there's a singular, crucial message to keep in mind. A piece of advice that might seem simple, yet could prove vital. Lock your doors. Double-check your windows. Because the stories you are about to hear serve as a grim testament to the fact that sometimes the darkness outside holds more than just the night. Sometimes it holds someone watching, waiting. The familiar sounds of your home might just be masking footsteps that are not your own. Let's begin. Our first story takes us to the seemingly quiet suburbs of Minnesota during the harsh winter of 2013. The protagonist, a young woman named Rachel, was living alone at the time, finding comfort in the familiar routines of her life, insulated from the biting cold that often swept across the region. Her evenings were typically uneventful, a welcome respite from the demands of her work. She'd prepare a simple meal, perhaps watch some television or read a book. The silence of her small home, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator or the occasional gust of wind rattling the window panes. This particular night began no differently than any other, a blanket of fresh snow having just settled, muffling the world outside into a deceptive calm. The snowfall that evening had been particularly heavy, transforming the landscape into a pristine, unbroken expanse of white. Trees were laden with it, their branches bowing under the weight, and the streets lay covered, absorbing sound and light, creating an almost ethereal silence. For Rachel, looking out from her warm living room, it was a picturesque scene, the kind you'd see on a holiday card. Yet as the hours ticked by and the darkness deepened, the beauty of the snow-covered world began to carry a subtle, almost imperceptible undercurrent of isolation. The silence, once peaceful, started to feel a little too complete. The isolation a little too profound. As her usual bedtime approached, Rachel went through her nightly rituals. She checked that the doors were locked, a habit more than a conscious act of security in her sleepy neighborhood. She turned off the lights one by one, leaving only a small nightlight glowing in the hallway. As she climbed into bed, pulling the covers up against the chill that seemed to seep in from the windows, she couldn't shake a faint, nagging feeling. It wasn't quite fear, not yet, but a distinct sense of unease, as if some silent observer was out there, hidden by the shroud of the falling snow and the deep, impenetrable darkness of the Minnesota winter night. She tried to dismiss it, attributing the feeling to the solitude, the vast quietness of the snow-covered landscape, or perhaps an overactive imagination spurred by the late hour. Yet the feeling persisted, a subtle prickle on her skin, the sensation of being watched. She pulled her blankets tighter, closed her eyes and willed herself to sleep, hoping that the morning light would dispel the unsettling atmosphere that had crept into her home. Little did she know the true source of her unease was far more real and far more disturbing than she could have possibly imagined that cold, still night. The next morning, Rachel awoke to a world still draped in white, the sun casting a brilliant, almost blinding glare off the untouched snow in her backyard. The unease from the previous night had mostly faded with the arrival of daylight, dismissed as a product of being alone during a heavy snowfall. As she prepared her morning coffee, she glanced out her kitchen window, which overlooked her back porch and the yard beyond. It was then that she saw them, a clear, distinct line of footprints pressed into the pristine surface of the snow. Her heart gave a small, sudden lurch. The footprints were undeniably human, leading from the edge of her property across the untouched expanse of her backyard, directly up to her back porch. They stopped right at the edge of the porch, near the sliding glass door that led into her dining area. Then, just as clearly, another set of prints led away, retracing the path back towards the street before disappearing. There were no other marks in the snow, no signs of a delivery person having dropped off a package, no indication of a lost animal, just this solitary, purposeful trail leading to her home and then away again. Rachel's mind immediately started to race, trying to find a logical explanation for what she was seeing. Perhaps it was a neighbor who had come by early, though no one had mentioned anything. Maybe someone had gotten lost in the storm and approached her house looking for directions, then thought better of it. But the prints were so deliberate, so direct. They didn't meander. They went straight to her porch, lingered, and then retreated. The lack of any other disturbance was what made it particularly strange. No knocked-over bins, no stray items dropped, just the silent testimony of those footprints. The more she stared at them, the more unsettling the implications became. The prints were not random. They were focused entirely on her house, specifically her back porch. It wasn't someone cutting through her yard as a shortcut. It was someone who had approached her home, stood there for some unknown period, and then left. The thought sent a shiver down her spine, a cold echo of the unease she had felt the night before. The pristine snow, which had seemed so beautiful just moments earlier, now felt like a canvas displaying a violation of her privacy, a silent record of an unwelcome visitor. The following night, another layer of fresh snow fell, covering the previous day's unsettling discovery. Rachel found herself far more alert, her senses heightened. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind seemed to carry a new, more ominous significance. She double and triple checked the locks on her doors and windows, peering out into the darkness more frequently than she ever had before. Sleep did not come easily. Her mind kept replaying the image of those footprints, wondering about the unseen person who had made them. She hoped, desperately, that it had been a one-time, explainable event. But when morning dawned, Her hopes were cruelly dashed. As she hesitantly approached the kitchen window, a cold dread pooling in her stomach, she saw them again. A fresh set of footprints, almost identical to the ones from the day before, marred the newly fallen snow. They followed the same path from the edge of her yard directly to her back porch, and then away again. The sight was chilling. This was no longer a strange, isolated incident. It was becoming a pattern, a deliberate, recurring act. The fear that had been a subtle undercurrent now began to take a more solid, terrifying shape in her mind. This disturbing discovery became a horrifying daily ritual. Each morning Rachel would wake with a sense of trepidation, almost afraid to look outside. And each morning, if there had been fresh snowfall, the evidence was there. New footprints, a silent testament to someone's nightly vigil at her home. The person responsible was careful, leaving no other trace, just those methodical prints in the snow. The repetition was what made it so deeply unnerving. It suggested a persistent, focused interest in her home, and that was a profoundly disturbing thought to live with. Rachel's sense of security in her own home began to erode rapidly. She found herself constantly on edge, jumping at unexpected noises, scrutinizing every shadow. The simple act of being alone in her house, once a comfort, now felt like a vulnerability. She started drawing her curtains earlier, avoiding looking out the windows after dark, haunted by the image of those footprints and the unknown individual who left them there night after night, like a silent, unwelcome sentinel in the cold, dark expanse of her snow-covered yard. The feeling of being watched was no longer a vague unease, it was a certainty. Days turned into a week, and the pattern of the mysterious footprints continued with unnerving regularity whenever fresh snow fell. Rachel knew she couldn't simply live with this mounting fear and uncertainty. The rational part of her mind, though increasingly strained, insisted that she needed more than just the footprints as evidence. She needed to see who it was, or at least capture some undeniable proof of their presence. The thought of confronting someone was terrifying, but the thought of not knowing, of living under this silent siege, was becoming unbearable. She resolved to take action. Her decision led her to purchase a small, motion-activated security camera. It wasn't a particularly sophisticated device, but she hoped it would be enough to capture an image of her nocturnal visitor. With a knot of anxiety in her stomach, she mounted it carefully, positioning it so it had a clear view of the back porch and the area where the footprints always appeared. Setting it up felt like a small act of defiance, a way to reclaim some control over a situation that had left her feeling utterly powerless and exposed in her own sanctuary. The anxiety of waiting for the camera to potentially capture something was immense. Every creak of the house that night seemed amplified. Every shadow seemed to dance with malevolent intent. She imagined the camera's small lens out there in the cold, a silent witness to whatever might unfold. Would it capture an animal, a prankster, or something far more sinister? The possibilities swirled in her mind, each one more unsettling than the last. She found herself checking her phone constantly, as if expecting an alert that the camera had detected motion, her nerves stretched taut. Sleep that first night with the camera installed was fitful and interrupted by vivid, anxious dreams. She woke several times, her heart pounding, half expecting to hear a noise outside or see a notification from the camera app. The anticipation of what she might find on the footage in the morning was a heavy weight. Part of her desperately wanted to see nothing, for the footprints to have magically stopped, for the whole ordeal to be over. But another, more pragmatic part of her knew that she needed to see the truth, no matter how disturbing it might be. The next morning, with a mixture of dread and grim determination, Rachel retrieved the memory card from the security camera. Her hands trembled slightly as she inserted it into her laptop. The software whirred for a moment, loading the recorded clips from the previous night. The initial segments showed nothing but the still, snow-covered yard, bathed in the pale moonlight and the ambient glow from streetlights. Minutes of inactivity ticked by on the screen, and for a fleeting moment she allowed herself to hope that perhaps her visitor hadn't come. Then a timestamp from the early hours of the morning caught her eye. The footage began to play, and her breath hitched in her throat. A figure emerged from the darkness at the edge of her yard, moving with a slow, deliberate gait. It was a tall man, his features obscured by the low resolution and the darkness, but his height and build were distinct. He walked directly towards her back porch, just as the footprints had indicated on previous nights. He didn't rush, didn't sneak. He moved with an unnerving confidence, as if he had every right to be there. The man stopped at the edge of the porch, exactly where the footprints always ended. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, motionless, simply facing her house. Then, slowly, he turned his head and looked directly up towards her bedroom window. Even in the grainy footage, Rachel could feel the intensity of that gaze. He just stood there, watching her window, for several long, agonizing minutes. There was no sound, just the silent, chilling image of this stranger fixated on the room where she had been sleeping, completely unaware of his presence. Rachel felt a wave of nausea wash over her. Her blood ran cold. Seeing the actual person, the source of those mysterious footprints, was infinitely more terrifying than she had imagined. She replayed the clip several times, each viewing confirming the horrifying reality. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a deliberate act of intrusion, a violation of her deepest sense of safety. The man wasn't just passing by, he was watching her, specifically her as she slept. The realization was a chilling weight that settled deep in her soul. Shaken to her core by the footage, Rachel immediately contacted the police. She showed them the video, the clear evidence of the man's nightly visits. They took a report, promised to increase patrols in her area, but also cautioned her that without a clear facial identification or any overt act of aggression, their options were somewhat limited. The man was elusive, a ghost in the night. Despite the police involvement, the profound fear lingered. A constant companion to Rachel's days and a terrifying spectre in her nights. She felt exposed, vulnerable, as if his gaze could still penetrate her walls. A few days later, after another light snowfall, Rachel approached her kitchen window with a now familiar sense of dread. The footprints were there, as she had almost come to expect. A fresh set leading to and from her back porch, but this time there was something else, something that made her heart stop. Tucked into the frame of her sliding glass door, secured against the wind, was a small folded piece of paper. Her hands shook uncontrollably as she unlatched the door and carefully retrieved the note, her mind racing with horrifying possibilities. She unfolded the paper, her eyes scanning the neatly written words. The message was short, simple, and utterly terrifying. It read, "You looked peaceful last night." The ink was stark against the white paper, each letter a chilling confirmation of her worst fears. He hadn't just been outside, he had been close enough to observe her, to see her sleeping, and he wanted her to know it. The note was a deliberate act of psychological torment, a clear sign that he was aware of her, perhaps even aware of her fear, and was escalating his unnerving game. The note was the final, unbearable straw. The feeling of being watched, of being targeted, became overwhelming. The man was never caught, despite the police investigation and Rachel's continued vigilance. The incident left an indelible scar on her sense of security, a lasting trauma that made her question the safety of any home. Even years later, the memory of those footprints in the snow, the chilling footage of the tall man, and that horrifyingly intimate note would send a shiver of pure terror down her spine, a reminder of the night someone stood outside, watching her sleep. Our second story transports us to the dense, sprawling woodlands of rural Tennessee in the late summer of 2020. Our narrator, Kyle, and a small group of his closest friends had decided to escape the confines of their everyday lives for a weekend camping trip. They were experienced campers, or so they believed, drawn by the promise of crackling campfires, starlit nights, and the invigorating thrill of being surrounded by the untamed wilderness. They craved the disconnection from technology and the chance to reconnect with nature and each other, far from the noise and pressures of the city. They chose a spot deep within a state forest, miles from the nearest paved road or inhabited dwelling. The drive itself was an adventure, transitioning from smooth highways to gravel tracks, and finally to a rugged dirt path that tested the limits of Kyle's pickup truck. The isolation was palpable, a thick blanket of silence broken only by the chirping of insects and the distant calls of birds. As they unloaded their gear tents, sleeping bags, coolers filled with food and drink, a sense of excitement and anticipation filled the air. This was exactly the kind of remote getaway they had been hoping for. Setting up camp was a familiar ritual. Tents were pitched in a small clearing, a fire pit was established with stones found nearby, and soon the comforting aroma of wood smoke mingled with the scent of pine and damp earth. As the afternoon wore on, they explored their immediate surroundings, laughing and sharing stories, the camaraderie of the group strong against the backdrop of the imposing forest. The trees stood tall and ancient, their dense canopy filtering the sunlight, creating an atmosphere of serene seclusion. It felt like their own private corner of the world, a sanctuary from all worries. However, as dusk began to settle, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, the character of the woods started to subtly shift. The familiar sounds of daylight faded, replaced by the more mysterious symphony of the night. Shadows lengthened and deepened, and the vast silent trees seemed to watch with an ancient stoic patience. Around the flickering campfire they told stories, some humorous, some a little spooky, the kind that are obligatory on any camping trip. None of them could have predicted that the real fear lurking in those woods would far surpass any tale they could conjure. The night deepened, and the campfire, once a roaring blaze, began to dwindle to glowing embers. One by one, Kyle and his friends decided to turn in, retreating to the relative warmth and perceived safety of their tents. They zipped themselves into their sleeping bags, the conversations quieting down to sleepy murmurs and then to silence. The only sounds were the gentle rustling of leaves in the night breeze and the occasional chirp of a cricket, sounds that should have lulled them into a peaceful slumber under the vast Tennessee sky. It was sometime after midnight when the first unusual sound broke the stillness. Kyle was drifting in that hazy space between wakefulness and sleep when he heard it, a faint tapping. It was rhythmic but soft, almost tentative. He initially dismissed it, his mind supplying logical explanations. A branch brushing against the tent fabric in the wind, a small animal scurrying past, perhaps even one of his friends in the adjacent tent shifting in their sleep. He closed his eyes, trying to ignore it, to sink back into the welcome oblivion of sleep. But the tapping didn't stop. Instead, it seemed to grow slightly more insistent, more defined. It wasn't the random, irregular sound of a branch. This had a distinct cadence, a deliberate quality to it. Tap, 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 pause, tap. It seemed to be coming from the side of their tent that faced the deepest, darkest part of the woods. Kyle strained his ears, trying to pinpoint its exact origin. He could hear the soft, even breathing of his friends beside him, apparently still asleep, or perhaps pretending to be, equally unnerved by the unexplained noise. A sense of unease began to creep through Kyle. He slowly propped himself up on an elbow, listening intently. The tapping continued, a persistent, methodical sound that seemed entirely out of place in the natural symphony of the nocturnal forest. He exchanged a nervous glance with his friend Mark, who was now also awake, his eyes wide in the dim light filtering through the tent fabric. Whispers began to circulate within the tent. "What is that? Do you hear it?" The initial dismissal had given way to a growing apprehension, a shared feeling that something outside was not quite right. Suddenly, as quickly as it had begun, the rhythmic tapping ceased. An abrupt, heavy silence descended upon the campsite, a silence that felt even more charged and ominous than the unsettling sounds that had preceded it. Kyle and his friends remained frozen, their breaths held tight in their chests, ears straining for any indication of what might happen next. Every nerve ending seemed to be on high alert. The woods outside, which had earlier felt like a peaceful sanctuary, now seemed to be a vast dark void, holding an unknown and potentially hostile presence. Then a new sound sliced through the tent's quiet, a sound far more direct and terrifying than the tapping. It was the distinct, unmistakable rasp of a zipper, slow, deliberate, unnervingly close. Someone or something was unzipping their tent from the outside. Panic surged through Kyle, cold and sharp. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the suffocating silence between each pull of the zipper. He could feel the collective terror of his friends, a palpable wave of fear that filled the small, confined space of the tent. No one dared to move, no one dared to make a sound. They were trapped, vulnerable, with only a thin layer of nylon separating them from whatever lurked just inches away in the pitch-black Tennessee night. The zipper continued its slow, agonizing journey, each metallic tooth grating against the next with horrifying clarity. It felt as if time itself had slowed down, each second stretching into an eternity of suspense and dread. Who could it be? A lost hiker, a curious animal with an unusual dexterity? Or was it something far more sinister, drawn to their remote campsite? The zipper stopped abruptly, about halfway down the tent door. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the ragged, shallow breathing of the terrified occupants within. They lay there, paralyzed by fear, staring at the partially unzipped opening, a dark slit against the faint glow of the night sky. The anticipation of what might appear in that gap, what might try to enter their fragile shelter, was almost unbearable. It was a primal fear, the fear of the unknown, the unseen, waiting just beyond the flimsy barrier of their tent. After what felt like an eternity of suffocating silence, with no further sounds or movements from outside the tent, Kyle and his friends slowly began to stir. The immediate, paralyzing terror had subsided slightly, replaced by a desperate need to know what had happened, who or what had been just outside their tent. With trembling hands, one of them cautiously reached for the zipper, ready to either defend themselves or find nothing at all. They peered through the small opening, their eyes struggling to adjust to the profound darkness of the forest night. Summoning every ounce of courage they possessed, they slowly unzipped the tent fully from the inside and cautiously poked their heads out, armed with the brightest flashlights they had. The beams cut sharp cones through the inky blackness, sweeping across the campsite, illuminating the trees, the dead fire pit, and the surrounding undergrowth. At first glance, everything appeared normal. There was no immediate sign of an intruder, no animal, no person lurking in the shadows. A wave of confused relief washed over them, quickly followed by renewed apprehension. Had they imagined it? As their flashlight beams danced across the damp earth around their tent, they noticed something that made their blood run cold. There, clearly imprinted in the soft soil, were footprints. Not animal tracks, but undeniably human footprints. And what was even more disturbing was that the prints were barefoot. Distinct outlines of toes, heels, and the arch of a foot pressed into the ground, leading up to where the zipper had been tampered with, and then trailing off towards the dense, uninviting darkness of the deeper woods. The discovery of the barefoot human footprints sent a fresh wave of terror through the group. This wasn't some random animal. It was a person, someone who had been silently watching them, close enough to touch their tent, to methodically unzip it. The fact that they were barefoot in the rough, unforgiving terrain of the forest added another layer of bizarre unease. Who would wander these woods at night without shoes? The implications were deeply unsettling. They were not alone, and whoever shared these woods with them was behaving in a profoundly disturbing and unpredictable manner. The sight of those barefoot prints ignited a strange mixture of emotions within Kyle and his friends. The initial terror was still potent, but it was now mingled with a surge of adrenaline, a touch of anger, and a desperate curiosity. Who was out there? Why were they tormenting them? Were they in genuine danger, or was this some elaborate, twisted prank? They felt a compelling, if reckless, urge to find out, to confront the source of their fear, or at least to understand what they were dealing with. They couldn't just huddle in their tent, waiting for whatever was out there to return. Armed with their brightest flashlights and whatever makeshift weapons they could find, a hatchet for chopping firewood, sturdy branches, they made the decision to follow the footprints. It was a risky choice, venturing out into the pitch-black woods, knowing that someone or something was potentially leading them into a trap. But the alternative, cowering in their tent, felt equally unbearable. They moved cautiously, their flashlight beams cutting nervous paths through the dense undergrowth, every snap of a twig underfoot sounding like a gunshot in the otherwise silent forest. The footprints led them away from the relative openness of their campsite and deeper into the thicket, where the trees grew closer together and the darkness seemed to press in on them from all sides. The sounds of the forest, which had earlier been a backdrop of crickets and rustling leaves, now seemed amplified, each noise carrying a potential threat. A hooting owl made them jump. The scuttling of some small creature in the leaves sent their hearts racing. Their senses were on overdrive, straining to detect any sign of movement, any hint of the person they were tracking. After several minutes of tense searching, the trail of footprints became less distinct, eventually disappearing altogether on a patch of hard, leaf-strewn ground. Frustration began to set in, mixed with a growing sense of unease. Had their pursuer simply vanished into the woods? Were they being watched even now, their clumsy attempts at tracking observed with amusement or malice? The darkness felt more oppressive than ever, and the realization that they were lost, chasing a phantom in an unfamiliar forest, began to dawn on them. The initial bravado was fading, replaced by a more primal urge to retreat. Defeated and increasingly spooked, Kyle and his friends decided to abandon their pursuit. The woods felt too vast, too menacing, and the idea of continuing to search for an unknown barefoot individual in the dead of night seemed foolhardy. Their priority shifted to getting back to the relative safety of their campsite, packing up their gear as quickly as possible, and leaving this unnerving place behind them. They turned back, their flashlights sweeping anxiously around them, half expecting something to emerge from the shadows at any moment. As they neared their campsite, one of Kyle's friends, David, let out a sharp, sudden gasp, his flashlight beam freezing on a point just beyond the edge of their clearing. "There!" he hissed, his voice tight with fear. "Behind that big oak tree, I saw something move." Instantly, all their flashlights converged on the spot, cutting through the darkness, desperately trying to illuminate whatever David had glimpsed. For a heart-stopping moment, they saw nothing but the gnarled trunk of the ancient tree and the dense foliage surrounding it. Then, as if materializing from the very shadows themselves, a face slowly emerged from behind the tree. It was pale, almost unnaturally so in the harsh glare of their combined flashlights. The features were thin, gaunt, with wide dark eyes that seemed to absorb the light, reflecting nothing back. The face was partially obscured by strands of lank, dark hair, but there was no mistaking its human form, nor the unnerving intensity of its silent, unblinking stare. It just hung there in the darkness, a disembodied mask of eerie watchfulness. The sight of that pale, thin face, with its hollow eyes fixed upon them, sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated terror through Kyle and his friends. There were no words, no threats, just that silent, horrifying stare from the depths of the woods. They didn't wait to see what it would do next. They turned and fled, scrambling back to their tents, their previous fear now magnified tenfold. They abandoned their camping trip right then and there, hastily throwing their gear into the truck, their only thought to escape the woods and the chilling, silent observer, hidden within its depths. The memory of that face, materializing from the darkness, would haunt their nightmares for a long time to come. The year was 2008, and Emma found herself immersed in the vibrant, unceasing rhythm of downtown Chicago. Her apartment, perched many floors above the bustling streets, offered a panoramic view of the city's glittering skyline, a concrete jungle that pulsed with life day and night. She'd grown accustomed to the distant sirens, the hum of traffic, the feeling of being a small part of a massive, interconnected organism. Her evenings often stretched late, filled with work or the quiet solitude of reading, the city lights her constant companions. Little did she know, another far more sinister companion was slowly beginning to take notice of her nightly routines from the darkened anonymity of the urban expanse. One particularly unremarkable Tuesday night, or rather early Wednesday morning, Emma was winding down. The digital clock on her nightstand glowed with the numbers 3:13 a.m., a time when the city outside, though never truly silent, seemed to hold its breath. She'd just finished a chapter of her book, the story failing to grip her as much as the encroaching weariness. She moved through her apartment, the familiar comfort of her surroundings a stark contrast to the unsettling events that were about to unfold. This was a moment like any other. A transition from wakefulness to sleep, utterly mundane, yet it was the precipice of something deeply disturbing. As she passed by her large living room window, a window she usually cherished for its stunning views, something caught her eye. It was a flicker, a brief, almost subliminal impression of movement in the building across the way, or so she thought. She paused, peering into the darkness, trying to discern what it could have been. Perhaps a light switching on or off, or the reflection of something within her own apartment. She rationalized it, as anyone would, dismissing it as a trick of the tired eye, the play of shadows in a city that was a tapestry of light and dark. After all, what could there possibly be to see so many stories up in the dead of night? Despite her attempts to brush it off, an uncharacteristic sliver of unease began to embed itself in her mind. The city suddenly felt less like a protective cocoon and more like an exposed stage. She drew the curtains a little tighter that night, an unconscious act of seeking refuge from an unknown, unseen observer. The feeling lingered, a subtle disquiet that whispered at the edges of her perception, a premonition that the sanctity of her home, her private world high above the streets, was about to be violated in a way she couldn't yet comprehend. She told herself it was nothing, just the product of an overactive imagination in the lonely hours of the morning. The following night, as the witching hour approached, an undeniable sense of dread began to creep over Emma. The memory of that fleeting glimpse, that indistinct shape she had tried so hard to dismiss, returned with an unwelcome clarity. She found herself glancing at the clock more frequently, each tick seeming to amplify the silence in her apartment. The minutes leading up to 3:13 a.m. stretched into an eternity, filled with a nervous anticipation she couldn't shake. She fought the urge to go to the window to seek confirmation of a fear she desperately hoped was unfounded. Yet a morbid curiosity, a need to know, gnawed at her. Finally, as the clock displayed that now ominous time, 3:13 a.m., she found herself drawn to the window, almost against her will. Her heart pounded in her chest, a frantic drum against the stillness of the night. She pulled back the curtain just enough to peer out, her eyes scanning the windows of the building directly opposite hers. And then she saw it. Not a flicker this time, but a distinct silhouette, a human form, standing perfectly still in one of the darkened windows across the chasm of the city street. It was unmistakably a man, his shape outlined against some faint interior light, unmoving, apparently looking directly at her. The figure remained there, a silent, unblinking sentinel. Night after night, the disturbing ritual repeated itself. At precisely 3:13 a.m., if Emma dared to look, the man would be there, a steadfast observer in the vast urban landscape. The psychological toll was immense. Sleep became a luxury she could scarcely afford. Her nights consumed by a mixture of fear and a strange, unsettling obligation to check. Was he still there? Was he watching? The questions haunted her waking hours, and paranoia began to weave its insidious threads into the fabric of her daily life, making her doubt her own sanity. Emma desperately tried to find a logical explanation for what she was seeing. Could it be a mannequin strategically placed for some bizarre reason? Or perhaps a cleverly arranged set of objects that merely resembled a human figure in the low light? She even considered if it was some strange reflection, a trick of the glass and the city lights. But the unwavering consistency of its appearance, the subtle sense of intent she felt emanating from that distant window, and the sheer improbability of any other explanation left her with a chilling certainty. This was no illusion. Someone was watching her night after night with a terrifying patience. The nightly vigil of the silent watcher was already a heavy burden on Emma's psyche, a source of constant, low-burning anxiety that permeated her existence. But soon, the terror began to find new avenues to reach her, seeping into the vulnerable sanctuary of her sleep. Her dreams, once a refuge or a landscape of abstract anxieties, started to become unsettlingly specific. They were not filled with monstrous figures or dramatic chases, but with something far more insidious, soft, eerie whispers that seemed to echo in the darkness of her subconscious mind, chilling her to the core. The whispers were faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the natural sounds of her old apartment building or the distant city hum. But gradually they grew more defined, more articulate, though their meaning remained elusive and deeply unsettling. Sometimes she thought she could discern her own name being spoken, drawn out in a low, breathy tone. Other times the whispers seemed to be formless pleas, a soft murmuring that spoke of being unseen, of a desire to be acknowledged, to finally make a connection. The voice, if it could even be called that, was genderless, toneless, and utterly devoid of any human warmth or emotion. The line between her dreaming state and wakefulness began to fray, to blur in a terrifying way. She would jolt awake in the dead of night, unsure if the whispers had been part of a dream or if they were truly echoing in the silence of her bedroom. On several occasions she could have sworn she heard them emanating from the direction of the living room window, the very window where her silent tormentor kept his nightly watch. This new development added a horrifying dimension to her fear, suggesting that the presence was not just visual, but was somehow attempting to communicate, to bridge the physical distance between them. Emma's isolation deepened. The vibrant city she once loved now felt like a prison, each window a potential eye, each shadow a lurking threat. Who could she tell? How could she explain the man in the window, the whispers in her dreams without sounding unhinged? She imagined their skeptical faces, their polite dismissals. The fear of not being believed was almost as potent as the fear of the watcher himself. She was trapped in a terrifying reality that only she seemed to inhabit, a world where 3:13 a.m. brought not just a visual tormentor, but also a voice from the encroaching darkness. As the weeks crawled by, each one marked by the relentless 3:13 a.m. appearances, Emma felt as though the figure in the window across the street was becoming, if not clearer in detail, then certainly more potent in its oppressive presence. Perhaps it was her fear sharpening her senses, or maybe the watcher himself was growing bolder. But the silhouette seemed more defined, its stillness more absolute, its focus on her apartment more intense than ever before. She could almost feel the weight of that unwavering gaze. Even when she wasn't directly looking, a constant, invisible pressure. In a desperate attempt to reclaim some semblance of peace, Emma tried to alter her circumstances. She began sleeping on the couch in her small study, away from the direct line of sight of the living room window. She invested in heavy blackout curtains, hoping to physically block out the nightly intrusion. But these measures offered little solace. The oppressive feeling of being watched persisted, a sixth sense that transcended physical barriers. And sometimes, disturbingly, the faint whispers seemed to follow her, finding their way even into the study, as if the source was not confined to the window alone. One night, fueled by a desperate cocktail of exhaustion, anger and sheer terror, Emma made a decision. Instead of hiding, instead of cowering, she would confront this silent entity. As 3:13 a.m. approached, she steeled herself, walked to the living room window and pulled the curtains wide open. She stood there, fully visible, and stared directly at the shadowy figure in the window opposite. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she held her ground, meeting that unseen gaze with her own. For long, agonizing minutes they remained locked in this silent, transspatial standoff. The figure did not move, did not react. It simply continued to stare. The experience left her feeling even more vulnerable, more like a cornered animal. There was no victory in her defiance, only a deeper, more profound sense of dread. The game, if it was one, was entirely on his terms. The city, with its millions of inhabitants, its endless labyrinth of streets and buildings, had shrunk to this terrifyingly intimate stage. Her apartment and his window. The beautiful, sprawling panorama that had once brought her comfort was now tainted, holding a specific, pinpointed locus of terror that patiently awaited its designated time each night, ready to renew its silent, unnerving claim on her attention. The night that everything escalated began like many others, with a heavy cloak of dread settling over Emma, as the late hours wore on. A storm was brewing outside, the wind rattling her windows, the distant rumble of thunder adding a percussive soundtrack to her anxiety. Or perhaps it was an unnervingly still night, the usual city sounds muffled, creating a vacuum of silence that amplified her every fear. She was on edge, a taut wire of anticipation, expecting the familiar torment of the 3:13 a.m. vigil, yet somehow sensing that this night held a different, more malevolent promise. As the dreaded time arrived, she found herself compelled to look, a moth drawn to a terrifying flame. She approached the window cautiously, her breath catching in her throat. There he was, the man in the window across the street, a steadfast silhouette against the gloom. But tonight, something was different. It wasn't a change in his posture or any discernible movement, but rather an almost palpable shift in the atmosphere, a heightened sense of anticipation that seemed to emanate from the distant figure, as if he too knew that the established pattern was about to be broken. Suddenly a sound sliced through the oppressive silence of her apartment, a sound that was not a whisper, nor the distant city, nor the brewing storm. It was a distinct metallic creak, sharp and unsettlingly close. Her blood ran cold. Her gaze, previously fixed on the window across the way, was violently pulled downwards, towards the side of her own building, towards the skeletal structure of the fire escape that ran past her living room window. Her heart leapt into her throat as her eyes struggled to adjust to the darkness, a horrifying realization dawning with agonizing slowness. There, clinging to the cold metal rungs of the fire escape, was a figure, a dark shape, slowly, deliberately climbing upwards, towards her window. The man wasn't just a distant, passive observer anymore, a figment she could almost convince herself was imagined. He was real, he was active, and he was no longer content to watch from afar. The terror was no longer an abstract dread confined to a window pane across the street. It was now a visceral, immediate threat, scaling the walls of her sanctuary, intent on closing the final distance. Panic, raw and overwhelming, seized Emma in its icy grip. Her mind raced, a chaotic torrent of fear and disbelief. The sounds from the fire escape were undeniable now. The scrape of shoes on metal, the slight groan of the structure under weight, each noise a terrifying marker of the intruder's ascent. Should she scream? Call the police? Hide? Every instinct screamed at her to act, yet her limbs felt leaden, her breath trapped in her lungs. The figure was getting closer, the vague shape resolving into something more terrifyingly human with each upward movement towards her window. Then it was there, right outside her window. The dark form filled the pane, obscuring the city lights beyond. For a horrifying moment she thought she could make out the faint outline of a face, pressed close to the glass, eyes she couldn't see but could feel burning into her. She heard a soft fumbling, a scratching sound, perhaps at the window latch, a terrifying indication of intent to enter. Emma finally stumbled backwards, a choked gasp escaping her lips, her mind struggling to process the nightmare unfolding just inches away, separated only by a thin sheet of glass. Suddenly, just as abruptly as it began, the activity at the window ceased. The fumbling stopped. The figure seemed to freeze for a moment, then, with a slowness that was almost more unnerving than the previous action, it began to retreat, descending back down the fire escape and disappearing into the shadows below. Emma remained frozen, trembling uncontrollably, listening for any sound, any indication of its return. Had she imagined it? Had the police been silently alerted by a neighbour? Or had the figure simply decided its work for the night was done? The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with unspeakable fear. As the first grey light of dawn began to bleed into the sky, painting the city in sombre hues, Emma, still shaken to her core, found the courage to approach the window. The cold night air, combined with her own panicked breaths, had caused the glass to fog over. And there, scrawled into the condensation, as if written by a spectral finger, was a message. 3 chilling words that confirmed her deepest fears and offered a terrifying new understanding of her ordeal. Thanks for finally seeing me. The Watcher hadn't just wanted to look, he had wanted to be acknowledged, and her terror had been his reward. They often say that the unknown is what truly terrifies us. The shadows that dance in the periphery of our vision, the unexplained sounds that echo just beyond our immediate understanding, the unsettling questions that tend to linger unanswered in the oppressive silence of the dead of night. But perhaps the most profound and chilling fear isn't just the unknown itself, but the horrifying moment of dawning realization when that unknown entity, that lurking presence you had only vaguely suspected or tried to rationalize away, turns its undivided attention directly towards you, acknowledging your existence and staring right back into the depths of your very soul, making you question the perceived safety of your own once familiar reality. The stories you've heard recounted tonight, Rachel's snowy dread in the quiet suburbs, Kyle's woodland terror under a canopy of unseen eyes, and Emma's urban nightmare played out high above the indifferent city streets. They aren't just tales spun from the threads of mere imagination, but rather they are chilling echoes of experiences that precariously blur the indistinct line between the mundane, everyday world and the terrifyingly real possibility of unexplained horror. Each unexpected creak of a floorboard in an empty house, each fleeting shadow glimpsed from the corner of your eye, each momentary, unidentifiable reflection in a darkened window pane now inevitably carries a heavier, more sinister weight, a more disturbing possibility. These encounters, these brushes with the unsettling and the unexplained, serve as stark reminders that the delicate veil between our perceived safety and the gaping abyss of the unknown can be terrifyingly thin, almost transparent at times. And sometimes, far more often than we might care to admit, that fragile barrier is deliberately breached by something or someone that has been patiently waiting just outside your locked door, just beyond the familiarity of your window. If these unsettling accounts have resonated deep within you, if they've caused you to glance nervously over your shoulder or to double-check the locks on your doors and windows tonight, then we invite you to join our growing community of those who seek out the chilling truth that often hides behind the veil of fear. Don't forget to like this video if it sent a shiver down your spine. Share it with others who you know appreciate the darker, more mysterious side of reality. And most importantly, subscribe to Moneymaker. Here we delve into the unsettling, the disturbing, and the often inexplicable. Because we understand that true horror doesn't always need the elaborate embellishments of fiction. Sometimes it's already out there, an unwelcome guest waiting patiently just outside. As we leave you tonight with these stories echoing in the quiet, shadowed corners of your mind, consider the very space you currently inhabit. The familiar walls, the darkened windows, the profound silence of the late hour, soft whisper